Mhm.
Welcome to this bi-weekly appointment, Today's Communicators. I'm your host, Kris Reichert, and we are multi-streaming right now on various platforms. So I'd like to say hello to anybody following us on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, and also on LinkedIn. I'm here in the studios today with Natasha Slater. She is a public relations expert. She is an entrepreneur. She's founder of the brand The Dinner Conversations, and she's very well known for her communications with the luxury and fashion brands in Milan. I'd like to welcome her. She's UK born, but resident of Italy. Here she is, Natasha Slater. Hi, how are you?
Kris, how are you? And it's so nice to be here and with everyone else who's watching us right now.
Yes, so very nice to have you here. Thanks for coming in for this appointment of Today's Communicators. Of course, we're going to be talking all about communications and how communication has changed drastically after 2020, how it's changed in the last decade, how we've all taken on these new forms of communicating because we have so many more tools available, so many more platforms to speak from, and what kind of people are communicating today? Like, who are they really? Because from what I've noticed, we are all potentially today's communicators if we wanted to be, because we have so much available to us right now. So let's just go back to our beginning days, Natasha, when you were like opening up your PR agency, when I was on MTV or as a television presenter, radio host, our earlier stages in our careers. How do you find communication has changed from way back then to how it is now?
Well, I think also really from my experience in nightclub promoting and as a DJ, I think we had to build our communities almost like physically. So we relied as a DJ, and maybe you did as well as a radio DJ, of having people tuning in to listen to you. So, you know, you had to build your community and you didn't really have an opportunity to advertise that moment beforehand. So, you know, you really had to rely on a very, very dedicated community, people that really followed you because they really believed in your message, because you really spoke to them, you know. And I think that that is maybe the difference today. Communications change a lot in the fact that we'd have a solid community that followed us, that showed up for us, especially when I was DJing, that liked the kind of music I played or liked my party because it touched them. So from that point of view, maybe not a lot has changed, but definitely in the approach. I mean, we didn't use our phones really as much. I mean, we had MySpace. Do you remember MySpace? I was like, we had MySpace, and then it was like, Facebook seemed revolutionary at the time, but MySpace was definitely much more music orientated, and it was where we started to connect with each other digitally. And I think that was really interesting in terms of, you know, we had to talk to a following that was physically near us, but with digital, we're able to communicate with people living in other cities and other countries.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. You know, it's funny. I was just posting something last night. Sorry, we've got a little bit of feedback going on there. This is the second week that I'm actually going live with Today's Communicators. So it's still kind of like a testing ground. I'm still figuring this whole thing out. It's exciting nonetheless. But I just posted something last night talking about the difference from when I started my career. You know, I was on the red carpets. I was working for MTV. I was interviewing the big stars. And you had to have a certain level of criteria, of course, to get to that place of being in the limelight and being able to communicate, you know, to stand on that platform. And in those days, it was the stages and the red carpets. And I find that now the platforms are social media platforms, because anyone, if they wanted to, can actually go live. They can turn on their cameras and you can broadcast from wherever you'd like to be. Like I was broadcasting live from my bedroom last night. And I mean, this is such a drastic difference and such an evolution in the forms of communication, but also in the possibilities and the availability to be a communicator today. If you have a strong message and you'd like to bring it to the world, you absolutely can, without a question. You can do it when you want, from wherever you want. So yeah, things have really drastically changed. And what about from 2020? Like, I mean, you know, obviously communication, where has it gone? Completely down the drain as far as face-to-face, because we can't be face-to-face anymore. And if we are, we have to wear masks. So even 2020, how has that, I mean, let's just talk about the drastic, complete upheaval in the world of communication today.
Well, I think let's just say 2020 was the year of Zoom, and everybody discovered Zoom. If you weren't on Zoom, you were like nobody, you were out, because everything from bar mitzvahs to birthday parties to even weddings and business meetings and those numerous calls and calls and calls have all been hosted on Zoom. So Zoom was a big deal in 2020, and whoever has or the owner of Zooms are very, very happy. They've done very, very. And as we move from 2020, I think of getting used to being on a digital platform, being used to operating our daily communication digitally, we're now seeing different types of apps opening. As we've both discovered in 2021, we're all getting onto the new app House Club, which Clubhouse, sorry, I'm getting it wrong already.
You're too much on Clubhouse that you're getting like brain fog.
Clubhouse brain fog. So, but I think that, we are adapting to digital life in terms of communication. And I definitely know that we're all going to want to come back and have physical communication, because I really truly believe, as a communications expert, that digital will never completely replace the need for physical connections and physical face-to-face. I think there are certain things that can be done face-to-face that are definitely slightly more tricky to be done. Although the world has proved in 2020 that we can pretty much do anything digitally and that we can operate, but still it's left a lot of people feeling extremely lonely and isolated.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why you mentioned Clubhouse. And in fact, the introduction of Clubhouse is really revolutionary, because we're building online communities now, where the communities were the people that would come out to the gigs that you had, or, you'd meet up at the local bar for a drink or whatever it was in the past. Now we're building these online communities. And I think the reason why Clubhouse is becoming so addictive in its nature is because we finally feel like when we get into a room where people are talking our own same language and we're communicating on not just a superficial level, but when you're only speaking with somebody, it's just like having a telephone conversation with somebody. It's very intimate, because there's an intimacy involved with just our audio, with just our voices. And so we are building these communities. And in fact, you talked a lot to me about the importance of building an online community on Clubhouse, because it is such a powerful tool that's just become recently available to us all. And so, we're both advocates on promoting it and trying to get people in there, because it's so wonderful to feel a part of something like that when outside we can't right now. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's always been a need, and I just want to go back to something you said about building communities and the need to build them online. I think in general, there's always been a need to build communities. And one of my areas of expertise in PR and communications has been very, very strong on helping brands build communities. Communities are powerful. They have been since history, since the age of time. We need community. People need to be part of community. And it's interesting, we talk about community, when I talk even with my teenage daughter about, the way that we have more and more labels coming out, and we're talking about inclusivity and diversity, the need to address those subjects with care and making sure that your language is correct. And that is because people do identify with communities, and it's very important that we respect the communities and the language within communities, because it really is where people are able to share their authentic selves and feel free to express themselves. So, we're really just sort of updating communications all the time. But at the end of the day, we're still going back to what we already know, which is like, the cavemen had communities, and we're going back to that. We
definitely
need to be part of something. It's like, what movement are you part of? What are you today? The language is like, what are you an advocate for? What and are you an activist for? And I see that when I go on Clubhouse and I see profiles and I look through all the people that follow us or that we interact with, and I go and look at their profiles, and I have to say I'm joyous to find that so many people are happy to label themselves with words like feminist, activist, advocate, LGBTQIA rights, inclusion, diversity, and violence against women. And this is really, really popular, is slightly tricky word to use, but what I'm saying is people identify today in terms of communication with expressing what cause they care about.
Absolutely. Well said. In fact, and you mentioned a few things that I just wanted to really touch upon. Like, first off, you talked about authenticity, and that's a big word that has really been brought to the forefront after what happened in 2020 and what we're still going through now. But I find that people today are really tapping into that authentic self when they're communicating. It seems to be a big difference I've noticed from when I communicated, let's say 20 years ago compared to now, is that it no longer is scripted. It's not as contrived. It seems to be much more real. It's coming from the heart. People have strong messages. In fact, their identity is based on their beliefs. And so they need to feel identified with what their belief system is and what their actions are for certain movements. And so when they identify with those things, and when we do label those things, people are proud of it, because it is a form of self-identity when you are associated with certain beliefs. And then so people are bringing forth these strong messages to new platforms like Clubhouse, where we are given a platform to speak on, where people have a voice like they've never had before. So people are really learning that quickly, if they have something to say, they can say it. On Clubhouse, it's literally like being brought up to the stage, because you have an area of each room that's the audience that you can just sit around and listen to the conversation taking place, the discussion. But if you have some value to add to that, you can raise your digital hand, be brought up to the podium, and you can actually speak. So we really have never had a voice that we can use so strong as we do now. So yeah, I'm really thrilled about this whole new platform, and thrilled about the fact that we are really understanding, we're tapping into what is real for us and how we need to express ourselves and how we need to convey our messages. You've worked a lot with brands. Now, branding is a huge way of conveying a message as well.
Absolutely. It's interesting what we were talking about, but I just did a talk on Clubhouse with a female empowerment group that I run every day, and we spoke about body positivity here in Italy. And what was interesting is that we were talking a lot about inclusion and that word. And it really is only when brands really understand how to use that word really properly, which inclusion doesn't mean adding the 10% and ticking off a box and saying, I'm inclusive. It really means changing your whole communication strategy. And I find that brands are a lot slower, and even luxury brands, it should be on the forefront of trends. What I've discovered through this pandemic is actually how slow and weary and almost worried they are of change. You know, adapting to change is not so easy. And we used to look at fashion as paving the way forward for trends and for us to let us know what was going to be. And yet it almost feels the reverse today, as if, you know, fashion is looking to everyone else to guide them. So that's quite an interesting shift that's happened in communications and in brands today. And it's going to be a fight for brands to stay on top. And the reason for that is obviously brands have big structures and companies and staff, and you know, you can't change everything over morning to night as much as it might be necessary. And we've seen brands make huge mistakes, such in the example as Victoria's Secret, which were not able to move their communication strategy to be more inclusive in a time where it was necessary, and they paid a big price for that. So I think the message I have when I work with brands,
I'm unaware. What happened with Victoria's Secret?
In terms of including transgender models and not inclusive for LGBTQIA community, and you know, women that no longer identify as women in the same sector as identify as they or identify as transgender. And I think it's such a good example of the fact that we cannot ignore other communities anymore in our brand strategies and think that they are minorities and consider them as a minority, and that we should not represent them. And brands have to be very careful when it comes to how they communicate inclusivity within their brand strategy, because it's very easy for them to make a mistake, to get it wrong, and them to be called out, as you said before earlier in our conversation, saying as that everybody today is a journalist, an award-winning journalist, and has a platform to write their opinion about something. And that opinion can travel second to second to second, to community, and before you know it, you have a huge crisis basically at your hands. And, you know, so I think I feel for brands as well, but I do feel also they have been very lazy how they've used a lot of, inclusivity and diversity, and they need to wake up and possibly definitely get themselves out there, listen more, and also be more inclusive in the type of people that they employ within their companies, to make sure that if you want to have an inclusive conversation, that begins within your actual structure and company.
Wow. Very, very insightful. So fascinating what you're talking about. In fact, that fashion and brands have looked towards, there's this flip side happening. So they've looked towards the trends and what's happening in society in order to base their brand strategies on. And so this is so fascinating because there's a total flip side. And in fact, I speak about this flip side when I talk about improvising. I have a coaching program called Speak with Impact, where I help professionals upgrade their communication skills. And I have a certain segment that's talking about improvisation and how we improvise in life. And I think that improv nowadays is really adaptability, how we adapt to change, because it's not what necessarily happens to us in life. You know, what happened in 2020, the misfortunes that take place. It's not what happens to us. It's how we choose to adapt to what's happened. And so this is interesting because brands now today are actually adapting to this change by using society as their role models to then tweak their behaviors. And I find that very, very an interesting take on that, because in fact, it's another way of using an example towards how to improvise in life in general. You know, I think that the biggest takeaway for myself and for many people I've spoken with, 2020, the biggest takeaway was the ability to adapt to change, because that hit us like the biggest curveball of our lives. You know, nobody was prepared for it. Nobody knew what to do with it. And it was just kind of like we were learning day by day. And so how we chose to adapt quickly, a lot of people reinvented themselves. I myself I'm a product of reinvention in 2020. And a lot of people really did that because it was a time everything stopped in the world. So we had to use that quiet time. We didn't have to, we could. It was a possibility. It was an opportunity. Along with all of the tragedy, I am not undermining that in any way whatsoever. Of course, a lot of families and people, it was very tragic in 2020, but there were, if we look for them, some opportunities to grow and learn from that. You know, there were some lessons to be learned. What's your biggest takeaway, would you say, Natasha, from 2020?
I think, well, to start with, if we look at business, the way that, you know, people will be working from home, smart working was the kind of key word for 2020, from pandemic or COVID.
Oh, you know what I learned? I learned that smart working is a term we use mostly in Italy. So in fact, I was using it until someone said, Kris, I believe it's remote working we're supposed to say. So
yeah, actually people use smart working a little bit internationally, but they also use remote working too, right? Smart working, it's definitely a term we use in Italy. But I think companies are realizing, or people are realizing, that they don't need to go to an office anymore. So I think that's changing really everything, even geographically, in the fact that people are questioning either whether they need to live in big cities anymore. Because if I don't need to go to an office anymore, then actually I could live wherever I want, basically, and be as effective. And what they found in a lot of studies with remote working or smart working is that actually they found very, very good results. They found that people are working very, very well. Another thing that's been discovered is it's changing the game for women, especially women who also have families. In fact, that they're able to manage their work-home balance better. So, you know, without having to have the commute in there or be somewhere else, they manage to take a break and maybe look after their kids a little bit, or manage that whatever that they're doing, and not feel that they're kind of alienated as a parent. So that's very interesting. So it could put more women back in the game of work. And I think that you know, the way how we communicate what we want as a society. And I definitely feel from 2020, what we've learned is what's important to us. So possibly, and I'm hoping that we're moving away from what was almost more of a superficial aspiration to life to a much more realistic one where we care more about the planet that we live on, climate change, causes, you know, from violence against women, domestic violence that's happening in the place, violence in general, human rights, women's rights, and any type of advocacy also for inclusion and diversity. And there are more people speaking up about that, and that's becoming more and more important for us. I also think sustainability is a big argument that's come into play in 2020 and goes into climate change. And I think people are looking at how they consume. That's one other huge thing is consumerism. You know, many people I've spoken to have said, you know, well, I'm just not consuming as much and I don't miss it. You know, i.e. people not feeling this constant need to buy because, you know, I don't have anywhere to go to necessarily. I don't have to show and be validated within a group of peers. And I don't need as much as I used to think or I was indoctrinated to believe I needed.
Absolutely, yes. It's amazing how humbling the whole experience of lockdown and everything that 2020 brought our way, where I found myself second guessing if I saw something I really liked or even online, you know, you ask yourself, it's almost like you really question whether you need it or not. If it's something that absolutely you would need. So what I learned to do is just close everything down, turn my brain off, walk away from whatever it was. And if the next day I still really wanted it, then it meant that maybe I needed it. But if I didn't think about it anymore, I obviously didn't need it. And that's a great exercise because it surely helped my pocketbook quite a lot by doing that. And yeah, it did teach us a lot going through that experience. But Natasha, you were always such an inspiration. I love what you have to say. I love the way you communicate. I always have. And I'm so looking forward to all the collaborations that we're going to have in the future. This is just the beginning. And so thank you so much for being with me today and talking about today's Communicators.
Yes. Oh, thank you.
Wonderful. All right. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody. We're going to be coming to you live. I will be coming to you live with a different guest every 2 weeks. So it's bi-weekly. And then we can multi-stream to all the different platforms. Thanks for being with us today and following the live. And hello to anybody who's going to be watching this recording. All right. Bye for now. Bye-bye. Bye, Natasha.
Bye, Kris. Thank you.